They said a woman had lost her mind the morning she hitched a mule to a rotting lighthouse and dragged it through the mud of Sorrow Flats, Nebraska, in the winter of 1887. She was 31 years old, barefoot inside boots 2 sizes too large, with $11.40 sewn into the lining of her coat, every cent she had left in the world after the bank took the farm, the drought took the harvest, and the county clerk took her dignity along with the deed. The lighthouse had been sitting in Amos Pruitt's salvage yard for 6 years, half sunk into the earth, its iron lantern room cracked, its wooden cladding black with rot and mold, and Pruitt let it go for $4 because he said it was good for nothing but kindling. What she dragged home that morning was more than a ruined tower. Sealed inside its base, beneath a false floor no one had ever thought to pry open, lay something that would not merely save her, it would restore an entire valley that had forgotten what it was worth. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Maren Elsa Voss. If you have ever lived somewhere the rest of the world seemed to forget, somewhere the rain stopped coming and the people started leaving, tell us in the comments, because this story is for you. Maren was born in 1856 in a sod house outside the town of Caldera, Nebraska, the second of 4 children born to Henrik and Britta Voss, who had come west from Wisconsin with a wagon, 2 oxen, and the unshakable conviction that land was the only honest promise the continent had left to make. Henrik Voss was not a man of many words, but he was a man of extraordinary patience, the kind of patience that understood weather and soil and the long, slow grammar of growing things. He taught Maren to read the sky the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture, not as a substitute for faith, but as an expression of it. A greenish light at the horizon before noon meant hail before supper. A ring around the moon meant the horses needed extra hay. The smell of iron in a summer wind meant you had perhaps 20 minutes to get the chickens in. Her mother Britta taught her something different and equally essential. Britta Voss could look at a broken thing, a cracked butter churn, a sprung wagon wheel, a rusted hinge, and see not what it was but what it could be made to be again. She kept a small leather satchel of tools under the kitchen table, a set of chisels and mallets and fine-toothed saws that had belonged to her own father, a cabinetmaker from Gothenburg, and on winter evenings when the snow sealed them inside the sod house like letters in an envelope, Britta would take something broken and, without ceremony or complaint, make it whole. She taught Maren to do the same. Not by explanation. By example. By placing the mallet in her daughter's small hand and standing back. Maren was not, by the standards of Caldera, a beautiful girl or a particularly social one. She was tall and angular, with the kind of face that looked severe in repose and entirely different when she smiled, which was not often enough for people to remember it. She had her father's patience and her mother's hands and a quality that neither of them had named but that their neighbors noticed, a stillness that did not read as timidity. When the other children ran from a thing, Maren walked toward it slowly, as though the world owed her the chance to have a closer look before she made up her mind. She was 12 when the county built the Caldera Navigation Beacon, a small lighthouse, not on any ocean but on the wide artificial reservoir that the Irrigation Commission had dug along the Platte River tributary to serve the farming communities of the valley. It was an unusual thing to see in a landlocked state, a lighthouse on a freshwater reservoir, and the men who built it were proud of the absurdity. The beacon guided grain barges and flat-bottomed supply boats across the reservoir at night, marking the channel and warning against the rocky shallows on the eastern bank. It was only 30 feet tall, white-painted wood over a heavy stone base, with a Fresnel lens in the lantern room that threw a beam 3 miles in every direction on a clear night. Maren watched them build it from the ridge above the reservoir, and she thought it was the most purposeful thing she had ever seen, a thing whose only reason for existing was to keep others from being lost in the dark. She went to school in Caldera until she was 15, and then she did not go anymore, because the school needed the desk for a boy whose family had more land. She did not register this as an injustice, exactly, it was simply the shape the world came in. She continued to educate herself with the 3 books her mother owned, the almanac her father renewed each year, and whatever newspapers arrived on the twice-weekly mail wagon from Grand Island. By the time she was 20 she had read more than most of the men in Caldera and argued less than all of them, which they took for agreement and which was something else entirely. In 1878, at 22, she married Olaf Brandt, a quiet Norwegian wheat farmer from the next township who had kind eyes and a forthright handshake and who fell in love with her, he said, because she was the only woman he'd ever met who looked at a fallow field the way he did, not with despair but with planning. They had 8 years together before the weather changed its mind about Nebraska. The drought came in stages, the way all true disasters come, first as a dry summer that people called unfortunate, then as a second dry summer that people called alarming, then as a third and fourth and fifth dry summer that people stopped calling anything because there were no more words that hadn't already been worn thin. The Platte tributary slowed to a thread. The reservoir shrank back from its banks like a man pulling his shoulders in against the cold. The grain barges stopped coming. The irrigation channels turned to cracked mud. The beacon on the reservoir, which had shone every night for 13 years, was quietly extinguished in the spring of 1883 because there was nothing left to guide. Olaf held on longer than most. He drilled a second well in 1884 and found water at 60 feet, which bought them one more harvest, a thin one, barely enough to cover the seed loan from the Caldera Agricultural Bank, which was managed, in those years, by a man named Corwin Ashe, who had come to Nebraska from Cincinnati with a bowler hat and a ledger that he treated with the reverence other men reserved for the Bible. Ashe was not a cruel man, exactly. He was something more dangerous than cruel. He was a man who believed the rules he enforced were natural law, as immutable as weather, and who therefore felt no guilt in enforcing them. When the harvest of 1885 came in at less than half what Olaf had projected, Ashe gave them 60 days. When the 60 days passed and no money had appeared, because money does not appear, it only moves, and in a drought it moves away, Ashe sent a rider with papers. Olaf signed them at the kitchen table while Maren stood in the doorway looking out at the fields where the wheat had not even bothered to come up. He signed them in the particular way a man signs something he knows is wrong but cannot prevent, carefully, precisely, as though his good penmanship might preserve some fragment of dignity. 2 weeks later, Maren stood in the yard and watched a sheriff's deputy nail a notice to the door of her house, and she did not cry, because she had finished crying sometime in the 3rd year of the drought and had not found occasion to start again. She had $11.40. Olaf had driven the wagon toward his sister's place in Iowa 3 days earlier, intending to send for her once he found work. She had stayed behind to settle what could be settled. She settled nothing, because there was nothing to settle. She walked into Caldera with her coat and her mother's leather tool satchel and $4 she had borrowed from the widow Sundstrom, who pressed the money into her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Amos Pruitt's salvage yard sat at the south end of Caldera's Main Street, a cathedral of useful ruin where broken farm machinery went to be slowly reclaimed by the earth. Pruitt was 70, nearly blind in one eye, and had the philosophy of a man who had watched enough things fail to no longer be surprised by failure. He let Maren walk the yard that cold December morning in 1887 without following her, without commentary, without the salesman's patter that men in his position often felt obligated to perform. She found the lighthouse at the back of the yard, tilted at a slight angle, its white paint gone entirely to black and gray, its iron lantern room sitting atop it like a rusted crown. The wooden cladding had separated from the stone base in several places, and a section of the exterior stairs had collapsed entirely. Someone, at some point, had nailed a board over the door at the base, and the nails had gone orange with rust. It looked like something the valley had finished with, like a monument to giving up. Maren stood in front of it for a long time. She did not think about the Fresnel lens, which Pruitt told her had been removed in 1884 and sold to a buyer in Omaha. She did not think about the practical difficulties of moving a 30-foot wooden and stone structure across 4 miles of winter-hardened mud. She thought about the base. Specifically, she thought about the fact that lighthouse bases, as her father had once explained while describing the lighthouses on Lake Michigan he had seen as a boy, were built with storage rooms inside the stone, sealed chambers for oil and tools and the keeper's equipment, chambers designed to be watertight, airtight, and very nearly permanent. She had not thought about this in 9 years. She did not know why she thought about it now, standing in a salvage yard in December with $11.40 and nothing else. Perhaps it was her mother's voice in the back of her mind, the voice that looked at broken things and asked not what they were but what they still contained. She offered Pruitt $3. He said $4. She paid $4 and shook his hand, and he lent her his strongest mule and a length of chain, and she spent the rest of that day and most of the next morning dragging the lighthouse through the frozen mud to the parcel of land on the edge of town that the widow Sundstrom had offered her the use of, a quarter-acre of scrub and frozen grass where Marin set up a canvas tent and called it home. The people of Caldera watched from windows and doorways and the gap between buildings, and they said the things people say when they have no context for what they are witnessing. They said she had grief sickness, which was a term the valley had coined for the particular madness that came from losing land. They said Olaf Brandt's wife had always been strange. They said Amos Pruitt ought to be ashamed of himself for taking $4 from a woman in that condition. Marin paid them no attention, because she was already working. She had pried the board from the base door on the first evening, using a crowbar from her mother's satchel, and found the door swollen shut with moisture and years. She spent 2 days working the hinges with oil and persuasion before the door opened. She found inside the base what she expected, an octagonal stone room approximately 6 feet across, its walls perfectly dry despite the exterior rot, its floor covered in a half-inch of dust and old wood shavings. There were 2 wooden shelving units built into the walls, empty now, and in the center of the floor, a heavy iron ring set into a fitted stone panel, a second floor, a sub-basement, a sealed chamber beneath the chamber. She almost missed it. She had crouched to examine the iron ring, assuming it was an anchor point for equipment, and it was only when she shifted her weight and felt the stone panel shift very slightly beneath her that she understood what she was standing on. It was not solid floor. It was a fitted stone door, set flush into the base, hinged on one side and sealed on the other with a padlock that had been driven into a lead housing to protect it from moisture. The padlock was old but not corroded, which told her the seal had held. She worked at it for most of an afternoon with a punch and a small hammer from her mother's satchel, and when the housing finally cracked and the lock released, she lifted the stone panel with both hands and set it aside and looked into the dark below. The smell that came up was stone and cold and something else, something dry and papery, the smell of things that had been waiting a very long time in very careful darkness. She went down with a candle. The chamber below was smaller, perhaps 4 feet deep and 5 feet across, lined in oilskin that had been tacked to the stone walls with copper tacks. The oilskin was intact. And on a wooden shelf that had been built into the eastern wall, sealed inside a tin box that had been soldered shut along every seam, were things that Marin Voss sat and looked at for a long time by candlelight, in the cold beneath the lighthouse, in the winter of 1887. The tin box contained, in order of the care with which they had been packed, a Fresnel lens prism, smaller than the one the lighthouse had carried in its lantern room, wrapped in chamois cloth and completely undamaged, 3 hand-drawn maps on heavy paper, each showing a different section of the Platte River tributary and the reservoir, marked with depths, channel positions, and notations in a small, meticulous hand, a leather journal, its cover embossed with the initials EAV, containing approximately 200 pages of entries in that same small hand, and beneath the journal, wrapped separately in chamois and then in oilskin, a set of engineering drawings, precise, professionally executed, bearing the letterhead of the United States Bureau of Irrigation and Reclamation, dated 1881, for a revised reservoir expansion that would triple the water capacity of the Caldera Valley. Marin sat in the cold for a long time. Then she went back up and made coffee on her small camp stove and sat outside the lighthouse door and thought. The journal was written by Edgar Amos Vance, who had been the lighthouse keeper at Caldera from 1870 to 1883. Marin had known the name, everyone in the valley had known it, but Vance had died in the spring of 1883, a month after the light was extinguished, and had left no family and, so far as anyone knew, no estate. He had been 73, a former surveyor for the Union Pacific Railroad, and he had been given the lighthouse keepership as a kind of pension for his years of service to the territory. But he had not spent his last years merely tending a light. The journal told another story entirely. Vance had spent the winters of 1879 through 1882 conducting his own private hydrological survey of the Platte tributary, walking the banks with instruments he had kept from his railroad surveying days, taking depth measurements and current readings and making notes on the aquifer behavior beneath the valley floor. He had, in the methodical way of a man who has spent his life measuring things, discovered something that the Irrigation Commission's original engineers had missed, or perhaps had not missed but had chosen not to report, for reasons that the journal did not speculate on but that Marin, reading between the lines, began to understand. There was water. Significant water. Not on the surface, where the drought had taken it, but below, a confined aquifer running beneath the eastern edge of the valley at a depth of between 80 and 120 feet, fed not by the local watershed but by snowmelt filtrating down from the higher ground 60 miles west. The original reservoir had been positioned and sized based on surface water calculations that ignored the aquifer entirely. If the reservoir were expanded eastward and deepened, and if a series of intake wells were drilled along the eastern bank at the coordinates Vance had marked on his maps, the aquifer could feed the reservoir through the driest summers. The engineering drawings were not Vance's own, they bore the Bureau of Reclamation letterhead, which meant Vance had sent his findings to someone in the federal government. He had sent them in 1881. The original drawings were still sealed in the Lighthouse base, which meant either his contact in Washington had died or moved on, or the letter had been lost, or, and here the journal's final entries became careful and oblique in a way that made Marin read them twice, the findings had been received and acknowledged and then quietly shelved by interests that preferred the valley's water situation to remain as it was. Whose interests? The journal did not say. But it noted, in an entry from October 1882, that a representative of the Caldera Agricultural Bank had visited the Lighthouse twice that autumn. It noted the representative's name. His name was Corwin Ash. Marin closed the journal and sat with that for a full day before she decided what to do with it. She did not decide quickly or carelessly. She understood that what she held was not simply evidence of neglect, it was evidence of something closer to deliberate suppression, and that the man who had suppressed it still ran the bank that had taken her farm, and still held mortgages on most of the remaining farms in the valley, and was still very much present in Caldera, still wearing his bowler hat, still carrying his ledger with its meticulous columns. She understood that a woman with a tent on a quarter-acre of scrub, a rotting lighthouse, and $11 had a limited number of ways to introduce federal engineering drawings into public conversation. She spent February and March doing two things simultaneously. The first was repairing the lighthouse. She worked on the exterior cladding with which she salvaged from collapsed outbuildings on the widow Sundstrom's property, piecing new boards into the rotted sections with the precision her mother had taught her. She rehung the collapsed section of stairs. She scraped and repainted the exterior in whitewash made from lime she traded 2 days of fence work to obtain. The people of Caldera watched this and moved through the spectrum from mockery to puzzlement to a silence that was its own form of attention. The second thing she did was write letters. She wrote to the Bureau of Reclamation in Washington, referencing the 1881 drawings by their letterhead number, which Vance had recorded in his journal. She wrote to the office of the Nebraska State Engineer. She wrote to a newspaper in Grand Island whose agricultural correspondent she had read for years and whose name she trusted. She wrote clearly and without embellishment, stating what she had found, where she had found it, and what she believed its significance to be. She did not mention Corwin Ash by name in the letters. She did not need to. The document spoke. The response, when it came, did not come quietly. In the third week of April, 3 men arrived in Caldera on the morning train from Grand Island, a federal land surveyor, a representative from the Bureau of Reclamation's regional office in Omaha, and the agricultural correspondent from the Grand Island newspaper, who had brown eyes and a notebook and who shook Marin's hand with the slightly surprised firmness of a man who had expected someone different. They spent a day in the Lighthouse reading Vance's journal and examining the engineering drawings. They spent a second day walking the eastern bank of the reservoir with instruments, taking the measurements Vance had specified, confirming the coordinates. On the third day, the Bureau representative held a public meeting in Caldera's church hall and told the assembled farmers of the valley what Edgar Vance had found in 1879 and what the valley had been sitting on top of for 8 years. He used words like aquifer and confined recharge and sustainable yield, but the farmers did not need the technical language. They understood the plain version: there was water. There had always been water. And someone had known about it. Corwin Ash sat in the third row of that meeting and did not speak. He was a man who had built his authority on information asymmetry, on knowing things that other people did not know, and watching that asymmetry collapse in a church hall in front of 60 Nebraska farm families was, for him, a species of ruin that no ledger could repair. He was not arrested. He was not charged with anything. The law of 1887 Nebraska offered limited remedies for a banker who had suppressed a federal survey report. But within 6 weeks of the public meeting, an investigation by the Bureau of Reclamation had resulted in 3 farm foreclosures being reviewed and 2 of them reversed on the grounds that the drought conditions that had triggered default had been artificially prolonged by the withholding of viable remediation information. One of the reversed foreclosures was for a farm 8 miles west of Caldera, a wheat farm that had belonged to a quiet Norwegian man who had driven his wagon to Iowa 18 months earlier and had not yet found occasion to send for his wife. Maren received the telegram from Olaf in the first week of May, when the intake wells along the eastern bank were already being surveyed for drilling and the reservoir had begun, almost imperceptibly, to show signs of rising. She read it in the doorway of the lighthouse, which she had finished repainting 2 weeks earlier, which stood white and straight in the spring light, which had no lens in its lantern room but which had already, in its way, guided enough people home. Corwin Ash left Caldera in June, for reasons he described to no one. The bank was purchased by a cooperative of valley farmers organized under a charter that the agricultural correspondent from Grand Island helped them draft. The charter's first act was to forgive the outstanding interest on loans made during the drought years, on the grounds that the hardship that had produced those loans had not been, as previously understood, entirely an act of God. We like to think about the things that wait for us in the places we are too quick to walk past. We like to think about Edgar Vance, an old surveyor in a lighthouse on a freshwater reservoir in Nebraska, spending his last winters measuring things he knew someone ought to know, sealing his findings in oilskin in the cold dark below the floor, trusting that the right person would eventually come looking. He could not have known it would take 6 years. He could not have known it would take a woman with $11 and a mule and a mother's gift for seeing what broken things still contained. But he sealed it anyway. He trusted anyway. And we think about that, the act of trusting a future you cannot see, more than we think about almost anything else in this story. Maren Elsa Voss lived in Caldera for the rest of her life, in a house she built on the widow Sundstrom's quarter-acre, adjacent to the lighthouse, which remained standing for another 40 years. She never did restore the lantern room, the lens was gone and she had no particular interest in replacing it. But every spring, on the anniversary of the public meeting in the church hall, she climbed the stairs to the top of the lighthouse and stood in the open lantern room in the evening light and looked out at the reservoir, which by 1891 had expanded to twice its original size and which glittered in the long horizontal light of Nebraska spring evenings with the particular brilliance of water that has been found again after being lost. The farmers in the valley called this her ritual. She called it nothing. She just went up and looked, the way her father had taught her to read the sky, not for any specific information, but to maintain the habit of looking carefully at what was actually there. We have told you the story of Maren Elsa Voss, who was laughed at in the winter of 1887 for dragging a rotting lighthouse through the mud of Sorrow Flats, Nebraska. We hope you remember her the next time you stand in front of a broken thing and feel the pull of something you cannot yet explain. We hope you remember Edgar Vance, sealing his trust in oilskin. We hope you remember the widow Sundstrom, who pressed $4 into Maren's hand and said nothing, because faith does not always require words. And we hope you remember that the valley's water was never gone. It was simply waiting, 80 feet below, for someone to ask the right question of the right piece of ground. Nobody was laughing come spring. And the spring after that. And every spring since. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Maren. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that overlooked things sometimes hold the most, and if you're new here, we would be glad to have you stay. Our question for you today is this: what is something in your own life that others dismissed or wrote off, that turned out to hold far more value than anyone expected? Tell us in the comments. We read every one, and we mean that. This is a community of people who look closer, and we are grateful every day that you are part of it. Until next time, stay close.